to criminalize people based upon their color, very quickly you have the introduction of black codes in the South. So imagine you were newly freed, right? And there are these laws that say if you're not employed, gainfully employed, or if you're just wandering around the streets, you will be arrested and convicted, right? People aren't just wandering around for the sake of wandering around. They're looking for their families that have been divided and sold off, right? They're looking for work, but who will hire them? Especially when, if we don't hire them and they're arrested, we can take back that convict labor, and they end up working on the same plantations that they had just been freed from. So we have now these black codes that have to be enforced. And it's largely militia that's enforcing these laws. And we're talking about, again, unreconstructed Southerners. But make no mistake, it's our shared history, because there will be slaves even in Boston until the 13th Amendment is ratified. So we also have in the South the rise of the KKK and the Concerned Citizens Council. Because if you have laws now that protect people, and you can't just force your will, right? Then what we will see is terror to try to curb action. And so once again, Congress forces through the ratification of another amendment, the 14th Amendment, my favorite amendment, the one that says that every state must treat you equally, right? Equal protection of the law. But see, when we talk about policing, we're talking about the enforcement of law. And what I need you to understand is that there are 3 branches of government, and all of them have been corrupted by this system, this long-lived system of racism and capitalism, right? So it's the laws that have been written by Congress, that are upheld by the courts, that have been enforced by the police. Well, the 14th Amendment said that all of you are equal under the law, but the Supreme Court decided that only meant not social equality, but political equality. So if you had the right to vote, that 14th Amendment was only covering your right to vote, and that's it. But once again, those unreconstructed Southerners will rise up and bring terror. And in 1868, throughout Louisiana and into Tennessee and Florida and Mississippi, these militia went door to door, slaughtering black men prior to the presidential election to ensure they would not vote. That terror, right, is not just terror against black people. It's terror against good people. When we talk about police violence, I hope that we're not just doing this us versus them, right, ideology, because that's what the purpose of dividing us by race was to do. It was to create this division, me versus you. And if we look at everyone who's enforcement and say that they are they, we're only perpetuating these issues, right? And we can't get behind the real issue, which is the institutional concerns and pressures. In social justice theory, before we look into a group and say that group is somehow dysfunctional in and of itself, we first ask the question, what institutional pressures are laid bare here upon this group that create that situation? When I was in Florida, I worked for the state of Florida for a while as a quasi-judicial position, hearing officer for driver's licenses, and I worked very closely with the police department there. I did ride-alongs, I went to checkpoints, I dealt with them every day. And I know that there were bad things that happened. I know. I saw it, I heard it, but they were good people too. But what happens, all right, if you try to stand on the side of right, if the power structure is against you? If you were in the Jim Crow South and you were white and you aligned yourself with black people, you could be hung as well, right? When we talk about these issues of criminalization, we're not just talking about race, we're talking about nationality. The KKK began to recede, if you will, at the turn of the 20th century because the black vote had been basically silenced. But they rose again in the later part of the 19-teens and into the 1920s, when we saw an emergence and rise of Eastern European immigrants into this country that threatened again the cultural norms. You have Black people who are now migrating out of the North out of the South into the North. And with the migration of Black people into the North and the emerging Europeans as well, we see now formalized policing in the North. Formalizing policing that will be there not to curb crime, but to curb action and to control. The idea of criminalizing Black people, Europeans, right, Eastern Europeans, immigrants, is not new to this country. But I'll tell you something, a line of connection that I see between now and the 1920s, when we had the Immigration Act that restricted anyone entering this country that wasn't basically from Western Europe, and the rise of the KKK to march down Pennsylvania Avenue with 1 million strong. What I see there was that the President Woodrow Wilson, was a vocalized, right, supporter of segregation. He ended any Black employment in the federal government. He touted the KKK as a white man's protector. And in response to that, we have the rise of the eugenics movement, and we have the rise of violence. We see the same types of rhetoric at the top levels today. I could go on, but I will say one thing to you, because I know we're talking about reform here, and we're talking about defunding. One, I'll say that I know Chief Jody Casper. I've been at the table with her at GCC before. We've been there with other chiefs of police across this area talking about how to bring in police officers who understand social justice. So I don't think that, I want the message to be that, again, we are trying to create an us versus them. But what I see is that it takes the next generation, each time we see the civil rights movement emerge again and move forward, this power movement that we see, it's always the younger generation. But what we know is that generationally, racism continues. And so I'm challenging you, I'm asking you, not to repeat the past this time, but to make real changes from the top down. And ask yourself, why is it that Black men and women keep being murdered? And why is it, that Ronald Greene in 2019 in Louisiana was running from the police, right? And then they beat him and killed him, and then said that he died because of the car crash that he was in. And I'll just say this to you. When you have a coverage level, it's not just the police on the ground, right? So we have to talk about top-down change. And with that, I'm going to stop and ask you to reflect. We want to hold a moment of silence for George Floyd, the 9 minutes and 26 seconds, I believe it was. Before we do, let me just say one more thing to you. When Chauvin was convicted, right, just to remind us of where we are, and that this is not just about one area of the country. But when Chauvin was convicted, the Fall River Police Department in Massachusetts posted in their Facebook this message. They said, Chauvin immediately stood and calmly placed his hands behind his back when he was convicted. Right? And then they said, imagine where we'd be today if George had done the same. It is a racist dog whistle, right? What change looks like is calling out the racism and not allowing those types of messages to go unconfronted. Chauvin was very much calm when he placed his arms behind his back, as calm as he was when he put his hands in his pockets and stared defiantly at a crowd that was begging him to spare George Floyd's life. Instead, he calmly looked at that crowd, put his hands in his pockets, and raised his feet off the ground. We can do better.